doing? We're good? Okay. And I know we have others who are working on their resilience to get through that gate, so we may focus Strickland. But thanks for coming. Thanks for being interested in this issue. My name's Gary Belkin. I lead an effort called COP Squared through the Billion Minds Project that I lead at Columbia University. You'll hear more about that. But what we really want to do today is think in an added dimension about what we mean by resilience. And so we're here at the Resilient Hub. The global resilience agenda has gotten increasingly clarified. Come and join us. Come on up. Yeah.
Also have to awkwardly, I'm texting my husband to schedule. No, it's all right. Okay. I just want to awkwardly sit next to you and write my husband back in New York, so that's where the children need to be when.
It's all about resilience.
And solidarity even across continents.
There you go. So, and so resilience has really come to be a more clarified, global-sized agenda, focusing on systems that need to be made resilient, that are critical to human functioning. The Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda defining 6 systems to make more resilience, food and agriculture, water, et cetera. But it takes another way of thinking about resilience and adaptation as terms that are also deeply psychological, behavioral, social. Because doing that systems change work is really hard. And it's getting harder. The work of adaptation confronts face-to-face, is really in the thick of what climate change is doing right now, not in the future, but right now in many parts of the world, and what that does to people. It takes resilient people to steward a resilient and nurturing planet. And so the meanings of resilient and adaptation that we want to focus on today and in this session is psychological resilience, psychological adaptation, and recognizing that is really the backbone of all the rest of the work of resilience and adaptation. And without paying attention to that backbone, we're going to have trouble doing the rest of the work. Now, this issue of psychological resilience often gets reduced to the notion of mental health and climate change, which is getting a lot more attention. And there's a lot of that in it. We know that all these climate harms double, triple rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, suicide, substance use. And so we have to really reimagine and rethink how we care for that in ways that reach the scale that we need. But we also have to understand that those things are just the leading edge of what is hard about all this. And that the cumulative effects of those and just the distress and burdens of seeing places disappear, of being afraid of damage, of economic precarity, of displacement and migration, the added effects of those not only creates a huge public health burden, but it creates a huge social health burden. It impacts the collective efficacy, the social strength, the ability for people to not only help repair the damage, but to have the strengths to change the circumstances. So as we talk about resilience in general, we talk about it as repair, but also as trying to be transformative, as being the way in to really not just protect systems, but to transform them more sustainably. The same is true for people. We need to give the tools, create the environment, make the investments that support the psychological resilience of people so that they can bear the damage, but also be strengthened and see mental health as a resource that strengthens them to do the change. So we're going to talk a bit more about what that looks like. We're going to hear about what that looks like, that enlarged sense of what this agenda is, by 2 folks who are virtual. And you'll be hearing in a moment from Jennifer Uchendu, who is an activist based in Lagos, and was just named to one of by BBC 100 list of women. She has developed a way that makes the work of sustainability actionable and sensible to youth in Nigeria, and that model is spreading beyond. And mixed in with that are methods of social and emotional support. So really, again, mixing in this repair and change capacity to come together in solidarity. Then you'll hear from John Benson-Aruda, who is in the Philippines, who is a psychologist at De La Salle University. I believe is associate professor at De La Salle University in Manila. He really focuses on the nexus of climate change and mental health, as well as in general breaking through the degree of marginalization of meeting mental health needs populations globally. And so they're going to give you a flavor of what this largeness of this issue looks like where they are. And then we're going to come back and talk in discussion together here about, okay, what do we do about it? And what actually is a plan that we have put forward and that went live this morning, which I'll talk a little bit more about, a roadmap that was mentioned in the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda to deliver at this COP for a pathway for the work of climate resilience globally to include the purpose of also building psychological resilience globally. And we think there's a path for that. We'll describe that. We have some of the partners who are going to put that to work with us here, starting with Kate Strand, okay, who comes from ICLEI, which is a network of thousands of local governments that really look at this organization as a source of learning and practice around sustainability for local governments, particularly local urban governments. And also to tell about how we're going to put this roadmap to work is Sheila Patel, who founded the Society for Promotion of Area Centers in the 80s. But that, I mean, we could have a whole session about Sheila, who has just really been a driver of women's empowerment, not just empowerment economically, but empowerment as experts and solution drivers and leaders in so many sectors, and now is going to take on to also be in the sector of building mentally thriving and psychologically thriving communities. So we're going to start with our friends virtually, and I think Jennifer, hey Jennifer. Jennifer, you're gonna kick off.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thanks for setting the stage very clearly. I'm really happy to be here to share my thoughts on this really important topic. And I'd like to start by saying mental illness as we had previously assumed them to be. And so for me as a young climate activist doing a lot of work in Africa, I have been working with young Africans for many years, catalyzing action from the community level and saying, well, we need to have youth-led approach to climate advocacy and climate action. And our broad idea of climate adaptation has been beyond, beyond the theoretical assumption and more about community-led narratives. And what I and many of my colleagues are seeing is that these climate-induced psychological impacts are really also about communities and communal bonds and connections. They're about collective action. They're about our climate narratives, the relationships, and the way we think of our place in the world. And that's why conversations on loss and damage are really important, because they tell you the full scope of the problem, that they are both financial and non-financial losses. And these losses are beyond our idea of mental illness. And a really good example is the young people that we work with, back home in Nigeria. So beyond feelings of anxiety, we see a lot of examples and lots of young people talking about hopelessness and feelings where well-being is impacted because it's just difficult to think of a future, a world. So where you have young people who are not able to, or who are already grieving a life not lived, we see a very peculiar public health problem, but also social problem, as Gary aptly pointed. And I think it's really important that, people pay attention, particularly to the roadmap and, the ideas that have been put into this document and this concept, basically looking at the many ways that we can work towards psychological resilience beyond the typical Western ways of knowing and approaching problems. Now at Susty Vibes, I started about 7, 8 years ago and working a lot with young people, catalyzing action for making young people and putting them at the forefront of climate leadership. But we also started to notice feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. And for us, it was really important that we find out what exactly the problem was. And so I started the Eco Anxiety Africa project, courageously starting to do a lot of research. And it was difficult as a climate activist going into the research world, trying to explore what exactly does it mean to have these feelings from the global south. And I'm very sure my colleague John will talk a bit of that on what that means, even from the Philippines. And we see that these emotions, these impacts are way broader than what we've been, taught to believe and what we assume them to believe. And that it's really important that people are empowered to imagine a future where they can cope, where they can thrive, where they can see themselves as people with agency. Agency is really important. It's something that we're seeing to be lacking a lot within our region, within the global south, within the young people that we work with, where they no longer see themselves as being able to act, being able to imagine their place in the world. And so we started the Eco Anxiety Africa project. And it was really core because mental health support already, as we are as epileptic, and access to this support isn't always available for young people. And so beyond research, we also have started advocacy through multiple networks. So not just mental health professionals, but also working with parents, teachers, governments, and across the entire stakeholder list of who can do something, who currently has power to make a change the way we see the problem, change the way we act, and the way we collectively work together, and also community support and action, leveraging particularly on intergenerational wisdom, as we see that is something very important to us in Africa, and also our indigenous wisdoms are the ways we understand wellness, illness have had to come back, because this crisis is bigger than us, it's overwhelming and it's complex. So it's really important that we go back to our roots and find out the ways that pre-colonial times, how have we handled crisis, and how have solidarity emerged from the continent, basically. And then finally, climate aware psychotherapy, very important to really bring it back into the conversation of mental health and look at the ways that we can all work together, particularly with mental health professionals and first responders. And in Africa, first responders could be anyone. It could be, local refugees or people within the community who have been given this title to support when there's times of crisis. So everyone really needs to know about this interconnection and really looking at the problem beyond mental illness as something that is a social problem that we really need to all work together and support. And this is why I'm really excited about the roadmap and the direction in which it's thinking. Thank you very much, Gary.
John, hi, it's Gary. It's good to see you. Go ahead, and it's great to see you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here in COP on the session on climate change and mental health and building psychological resilience. I am John Aruta. I am from Philippines, one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. I'm here to present the climate change and mental health nexus, but I'm looking at this issue from a global south perspective, particularly from the perspective of my home country, the Philippines. I'll also present social and structural factors associated with this issue and share effort towards solidarity and action. And I acknowledge that everyone in the world is already experiencing the climate crisis. In the Philippines, we're more familiar with typhoons, flooding, drought, and increased heat. And Mother Earth already gave us a deadline that if we do not reduce global warming by 1.5 degrees by 2030, change might not be reversible. And in the discourse of climate change and how it impacts humans, there is a rich discussion on how climate change is affecting human health, but very little discourse on climate change and mental health. And that's why I'm very happy that this session is happening and there are emerging efforts all over the world to be understanding this emerging nexus. But when we talk about climate change, mental health, we need to acknowledge that there's a global north and global south divide. You can see on your screen, countries highlighted with blue are global north countries. Often these are developed countries who are major drivers of the climate crisis. On the other hand, you see countries highlighted with red. They are often developing countries with very minimal contribution to global greenhouse gas emission and climate change. Unfortunately, global south countries face the most severe brunt of climate crisis, and this is an issue of climate justice that simply talks about who are main responsible for climate change and who are most hurt by the climate crisis. And take example, my home country, the Philippines, in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan, the most devastating, the strongest typhoon ever recorded in human history, hit the country, killed at least 6,000 people, and that's underestimation. Thousands of families are displaced, and until now, they don't have proper houses. The Philippines is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, as I mentioned, definitely the most climate hazard country in Southeast Asia. We experience at least 20 typhoons per year, some of which are super typhoons. And an average Filipino would experience 1,400 typhoons in his or her lifetime. And it's therefore not surprising that recent global evidence suggests that young Filipinos, based on global data, are the most climate anxious in the world. And I acknowledge, as Gary mentioned earlier, climate crisis already is impacting people's mental health. It is associated with suicide, with depression symptoms and disorders, trauma, etc. But there are other pathways where the climate crisis elicits psychological reactions. This one popular term today, what we call climate anxiety, I argue that this is not a psychological disorder because climate anxiety or our worries about climate change is normal because climate change is already happening. It is already devastating millions of people's lives and already threatening the future of the next generation. And so what's important is for us to collectively realize how can we translate all these emotions into action. And in the Philippines, we're happy that there are government efforts to climate mitigation and adaptation. There are climate activism happening in the Philippines. However, the Philippines is also one of the deadliest countries for climate activists and environmental defenders in the world because it is in the Philippines where we have the highest numbers of murders of environmental defenders and climate activists. And so we really need to together realize how we can eliminate this barrier to climate action and prioritize respect to people's lives. And so in the Philippines, we can effort to build communities of practice of climate change and mental health, where we bring together experts from different disciplines and we work together with different sectors, and directly we work with people in the communities to co-create solutions in addressing this seemingly insurmountable challenge posed by climate change and mental health crisis. And I will not forget to acknowledge the effort by COP Squared in ensuring increasing awareness on climate change, motivating action and advocacy in ways that are inclusive and prioritizes diversity. And together, I invite everyone to co-create solutions in addressing climate change and the mental health crisis. And let's not forget those populations that are most vulnerable in this crisis. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks very much. Kate and Sheila, why don't you come up? So we've sketched this idea that mental health, psychological resilience is really social health, social resilience. How do we build it that way? And so that's what we want to talk about next. And we have Dr. Chelsea Clinton here to moderate this discussion. Chelsea is the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, a clear advocate for health access at all levels and globally, and has become a real champion of that and pushing the foundation in more of that direction, and we appreciate those efforts. And the mic is yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for helping not only convene, but really catalyze this conversation. And I'm eager, certainly, to hear from Sheila and Kate, whom we haven't heard from yet, but I did first want to give you the chance, Gary, if you wanted to say more about the roadmap and kind of the specific challenges, not only kind of the kind of macro and normative challenges, but sort of the specific challenges and the specific plans kind of in the roadmap, because now we've made reference to it, but I don't know how many people who are with us here kind of in this space or joining us online kind of really have had the chance to kind of look at the substance. So maybe you could just share, a couple minutes, and then we'll plunge into the conversation.
Sounds good. John mentioned this organization that I also alluded to called COP Squared, Care of People times Planet, the notion that if we nurture people, it exponentially adds our power to care for the planet. That's about 450 organizations now globally that come at this issue from the diversity of perspectives that you've heard. Some are community organizers, some have worked on community mental health forever, some are coming from other intersectional issues, environmental justice and so forth, but they're all bouncing up against this issue that there's some aspect of psychological strengthening that has to be done and repair that has to be done to do this other climate work. And so through that network, we had 2 rounds of regional dialogues across that network. What should a plan look like to take on the size of this? And some key principles emerged that are in what we call the roadmap. That went live today on our website, COP and the number 2.org, copsquare.org. But it just some basic principles to get how it is a paradigm shift from how we usually think about addressing these issues that were mentioned. 1, the community is the mental health system. The mental health system is not the mental health system. The community is the mental health system. Everyone is a skillable frontliner in that health system. Second is that we think of psychological resilience not as some end state, not as some diagnostic category, but as a process that everybody can be a part of. It's a process of bolstering those psychological strengths that communities define for themselves, what they need to cope with the realities of climate and environmental damage. So it's very pragmatic, it's very targeted, and it looks at mental health and the toolkit, the psychological toolkit, as not just an end in itself, but as a means to these other community-defined ends. And so we implement it that way, and we intentionally design it so it's accountable to those other outcomes. And that psychological toolkit ranges from clinical knowledge, traditional knowledge, cultural knowledge, local knowledge. And the mechanism that we described further in the roadmap of how you can routinely pull that package of actionable work across wholly diverse different channels of workers is what we settle in. But we wanted to prove that it's doable. So we not only made this strategy, which was called for in the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda, that we delivered by COP, which we did with an hour to spare, of how this huge mobilization of work in climate resilience could also do the work of psychological resilience. So we said, we're going to show that this notion of psychological resilience is versatile enough to work in every sector across every system. So we've recruited 13 early adopters that show that diversity, that put this project to work, and 2 of our early adopters are here.
Great segue as we turn to 2 of the early adopters. And Sheila, I want to start with you. The promotion of area resource centers, Spark, and local governments for sustainability, ICLEI, are 2 such early adopters. And I wonder if you could just share kind of why it was so important for you and the organizations you work with to be part of this roadmap. And maybe also you could reflect on why you think it's important that community organizations who may not have been in the climate space actually need to be in now this community resilience work.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. So I have been working on issues of urban informality now for 4 to 5 decades. And at the center of everything I do is the power of aggregating isolated communities into social movements, at the center of which are women's collectives, acknowledging that the burden of surviving informally, invisibly, and often illegally in cities in the global south is a burden that's first and foremost managed by women in poor neighborhoods. They are never acknowledged, they remain invisible, they don't expect anybody to check with them. And we have a little role play in which we always find that the external person, who's often a man, now more women come to them, when they want to talk to communities, 5, 6 men stand in the front and tell them what they want. And if you talk to the women who are standing behind, they want the exact opposite. And that's the very powerful difference in how pragmatic, powerful, and long-term engagement community women bring into this process. So the organization which I founded, called Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Centers, is to give every community the right to have their own location where they discuss what they need to do themselves, and then aggregate those issues which matter to all of them and find solutions. So after doing this for 40 years and going after mayors and municipalities, we found that the legal route to get them legal entitlements only worked for 8 to 10% of all the 1.5 billion people who live informally today. So we decided that in our engagement with climate change, the real challenge that these women identified is that their homes are just unable to cope with extreme weather. And so I have this campaign, which is a sister campaign to Gary's, called Roof Over Our Heads, in which we build women's capacities to make assessments of their neighborhoods, their homes, and then bring all the people, including formal large businesses, to say, what can you do for this 1.4 billion people who live across so many southern cities, and see them as a market for whom you produce sustainable materials. You don't put the burden on the women to produce greenhouses. You put the burden on the producers and say, produce stuff for them. So when I met up with Gary, our first conversation is, we're both doing labs. We're looking at ways by which we build women's capacities or community capacities to assess and identify challenges they face and deal with them. At first, we thought, should each one piggyback on the other? And we said, no. Every single women's group in our network has the potential of becoming part of your program. We need to develop systemic ways of transferring knowledge and identifying the support system that they need. And we find already in the first few conversations that we've had with some of the technical and professional support groups that Gary has put us in touch with, simple things of what women can do to help a group de-stress themselves before they have a conversation. Simple things like that. Everybody comes all stressed out, and most of the time it ends up being fights, arguments, conflicts, even in a situation where they all need help. But to recognize that you bring your stress with you, that stress comes with all kinds of reasons, and that you need to acknowledge that your challenges, your uncertainties have to first be addressed before you become a support system to your community. And what would that be? And what would you do? And how important it is in the day-to-day conflict resolutions that women do, which later on have produced all kinds of things like murders in slums, violence, drug abuse, management of deep divisions that come out of simple conflicts that were not resolved. So for us, this is an amazing sister campaign, very important to bring in. And it reminded me how about 30 years ago, the Physician General of the United States was at a conference in Melbourne, and he was the chief speaker, and he says, 30 years from now, behind every crisis situation of physical health, you will find that it started with a mental health challenge that was not addressed. And we're seeing this right now. So, great, Gary.
Well, Sheila, that was certainly, I think, a wonderful place to kind of continue from Gary sharing kind of the roadmap at a high level and why it's been so important for you and Spark and most importantly, the women that you're working with to kind of be in solidarity with this sister campaign. You know, I wonder, Kate, if we can now turn to you and just ask a similar question, you know, why it was so important for local governments for sustainability to be part of this effort. Kind of how do you think about kind of the roadmap, kind of intersecting and strengthening with the work you're already doing and vice versa?
Thanks so much for the question. And yeah, for those that don't know ICLEI, ICLEI is a global network of cities. We're the biggest global network of cities working with both our mega cities and our tiny municipalities. And yeah, a lot of my perspectives are going to come from the African side because I manage our climate change resilience unit for Africa. So yeah, I think it's a great question, and we know that not only when we see climate impacts, we see the challenges that are associated with the social and economic disparities, but we then further see these challenges around mental health, and which increases our vulnerability of our communities. And the reality is that adaptation and resilience needs to be addressed at the local level, and this is the importance of engaging with local governments. But in order to do this, we need a paradigm shift in our approach of resilience planning at this local level. And I think one of the biggest problems we see is we always hear about, oh, we need to chart a new development pathway. We need to plan for climate resilience. And then we also need to think of our communities and our informal areas. But the reality is we need to bring these all together. When we start planning, we need to not be separating all of these into each of their own boxes, but we need to look at how we can bring them together. And if we're going to address our mental health issues within our communities, which we need to stop also looking at an individual trait, but rather at a community asset and looking at how we can include that in our planning. We need to be mainstreaming mental health in our adaptation plans at our local level. And this involves not just getting a consultant in and asking them to develop a climate change plan for your city, but it means engaging with our communities at a local level. It means ensuring that the voices of all are at that table when we start planning for climate resilience. We need to ensure that our vulnerable people are sitting in that meeting. And this is where I think ICLEI plays a really great role. Is we work along 5 different pathways, and one of them is a people-centered pathway. And this means ensuring that the voices of everyone are heard in our planning approaches. So working with our municipalities to co-create and co-develop our plans. And this means involving those community members, not just our middle class and our upper class in our community halls because they can access those community halls, but it means looking at new approaches. It might mean looking at what we call our walking workshops, where we actually are going and engaging with our community members and actually understanding what their needs are and including those in our plans moving forward.
Great. Well, Kate, thank you so much. And it shouldn't be radical to center communities and our most vulnerable voices, but certainly it is and will remain so until it no longer kind of will be seen as such. I wonder, Before we really open it up to kind of audience questions, I just, Jennifer and John, want to give you the chance if you want to share kind of additional kind of thoughts or reactions to what we've heard this morning already, or kind of some of the greater detail that I know you're already familiar with, of kind of what Gary shared in the roadmap. And so, Jennifer, maybe we can start with you if there are other kind of thoughts that you'd like to share, and then John, turn to you, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And it's been a delight to hear all of this perspective. They are very relevant and validating even of the work we do back home here. I think two things that jumped out to me from the conversation. Kate talked about listening to people, and I think it's really key. For a very long time, there's been a process where we talk to people, and we know we don't exchange information, and so much is lost in that process. So I do think it's important that we listen to people, see where they're coming from, their ideas, the narratives, and what feeds in what they think about their place in the world and how they can take action. And a project that Gary was also part of, we did in Nigeria, was just bringing intergenerational communities together, elders age 55 and above in Lagos, and young people, and just having conversations, learning about what climate distress looks like for them. So examples, like that show us how it's really important and empowering to listen to people. And then, secondly, is this idea that this is beyond community threats. This is actually an asset. When we start to upskill people and empower people, we see a healthier and a more empowered planet. And that really is the goal. The agenda for psychological resilience is about empowering people at a much larger scale. So when we think about climate adaptation, it's not just a very few being able to cope and thrive, but everyone, being able to cope, particularly young people, at-risk communities, and the most vulnerable, who are already, being impacted by climate injustice and the threat of the problem at large. So thank you so much for those really brilliant insights. And over to you, John.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's wonderful. I totally agree. And previously, we have reviewed the existing policies on climate change and separate policies on mental health in Southeast Asia. And one thing we're learning is that these policies in climate change have very little mentioning of mental health, and mental health policies in the region don't see climate change as one of the important factors. And so we really need to create policies that recognize the intersection between climate change and mental health. But when we create these policies, I agree with what and Jennifer mentioned, we need to listen to the voices of everyone, especially those who are more vulnerable. We need to make sure indigenous peoples are part of the conversation, people with low-income background, young people especially, even across generations. And it's necessary to create systems, policies, and interventions that are equitable, because in the context of climate change, we know that people with low-income backgrounds, those who are most vulnerable, are suffering the severe consequences, mental health consequences of climate-related events. And at the same time, they have very little access to mental health services. So we really need to reimagine how we create systems that are resilient, that also pay attention to the needs of those who have less voice, in the discourse on climate change and mental health. I'll stop there and happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
John and Jennifer and Kate and Sheila. And I now do want to open the floor to questions, or if you're doing work that you kind of would like to inject in and help highlight, if it relates to this conversation, we're certainly quite eager to hear that as well. So don't feel like you have to say something or ask a question. I have plenty of material to keep kind of probing our remarkable panelists and Gary, but very much would like to give you the chance, if you would like, to ask questions or to share your own work or reflections. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Wamik. Gary, nice to see you in person. I'm Wamik. I'm based in Bangladesh. I'm working with the World Bank. So over the last 2 to 3 years, we've been doing a lot of analytical work on linking the climate change issues with mental health outcomes, such as depression and anxiety. And we see that incremental increases in temperature is associated with higher prevalence of depression and anxiety both. So we know from global literature that exposure to heat, particularly sleep-disrupting heat, is a big contributor to not just suicidal ideations, self-harm, but also to gender-based violence, and you mentioned more general violence. So in countries like Bangladesh, where mental health is not at the forefront, what is a good way to engage the public and the government on raising its importance? So I was wondering perhaps if somebody could speak to that. Thank you.
You know, I wonder, Sheila and Kate, if we could start with you, and then we can also, again, turn to Jennifer and John to share kind of what you have found to be helpful, I think, in raising these issues with kind of the public sector and hopefully not only gaining, but really kind of grabbing government attention to shift policy priorities and budget priorities.
So I think the first thing that we do when we identify a challenge is to look at what are the networks and the leadership's views on that. Do they already know about it? Do they have views? Are they biased? Do they have misinformation? So how do you do that course correction so that everybody in your own network has a view that can coalesce into doing three things? First, what are the things you can do? You know, one of the things that all global institutions don't do is they treat poor people like victims. But the biggest asset you have in development are people themselves, and you ignore them, you ignore their asset base, you ignore their experience. So we start off by saying, what can we do for ourselves? What can we do for each other? And only the things that we cannot do for each other, which we cannot do for ourselves, is when we seek help. And some of that help comes from professional practitioners who would be counselors or support structures, and some would be structural in terms of what governments can do. So for instance, in most of our southern countries, there's a huge incidence of drug abuse amongst young children and young adults. It starts with eating tobacco and then moves on to other things. And it comes out of just some different kinds of things. And one of the things which we are trying to figure out is what is the relationship of what food you eat and what it does to your mind. Because now everybody knows that it's not just something psychological. Your physical nutrition has a contribution to make. So what are these things? What are these connections? What are stress-producing things? So unless you yourself understand these things and this knowledge gets democratized, the ability of people to put pressure on government with evidence, because in most cases, even our primary health care for even things like immunization is not adequate. So these kind of processes are seen as esoteric as far as the health system are concerned. So I think creating this evidence-based and starting with what people need to do, what communities need to do, for me, is a very powerful alternate starting way. And I think it's something that in the last 2 days of wherever I have talked, I've realized we need to make people the center of this process. They are all left as peripheral. We all get excited about all the money that different governments put. It's a piddly amount compared to what people contribute to their own transformation. And I think we need to just twist this and say, you know, in any case, most of that money is not accountable to poor people. We don't know if we are able to produce the requirements of institutional arrangements for this, how much of that will come. We don't know. So I'm just saying that we need to flip these things to say, don't make people victims, make them partners, make them center of this process. That's also part of what we need to put into what is now accepted as a climate and development challenge. It's no longer one or the other. And it was nice yesterday to hear the champions and the UN Secretary General and everybody talk about that. Otherwise, if you're doing something which looks like it's a medical thing, then they'll say, why is it coming in climate?
Kate?
Thanks so much. We know the importance of engaging with our community leaders around education and awareness, but I think we can also learn from the past. We've been through the COVID pandemic, and I think there was so much to learn from that, especially for our local governments. And we have such opportunity now. We know there's huge migration moving into our urban areas. We need housing, and we have these opportunities to start engaging with our citizens. And they may not say to you, oh, we need to consider mental health. But if we start engaging them around what their needs are, often you hear them say, oh, we need community spaces. We need a place where it's safe for women and children to talk to one another and be with one another, where our children can play and feel safe. And immediately in this, when we think of developing, for example, housing, why are we developing these big blocks of what we call informal housing by government or local governments that are just rows and rows of houses? We have such an opportunity to start integrating nature into these developments, creating community spaces, creating community centers for our communities. And I think this is an opportunity. We saw during COVID pandemic, people saying we were stuck in apartments, we weren't able to go outside, we weren't able to go into nature. Well, I think for me, this is such an important point. And you talk about the heat island effect. Well, here's one of your solutions where we can deal with climate change, but also it's contributing to mental health.
John, I saw you nodding a lot, so I don't know, John, if you want to kind of add anything.
Thank you so much. I think this is a great question, and I'm going to answer the question in general, but also have some perspective from the Global South. Number one, I think what's working so far is that if we engage governments, in conversations, for example, in some of our activities here locally, we invite the government, in sectors, experts, and even communities to engage in a dialogue where we can express the experiences of the communities and as well as the resources available and help the government, realize, co-create solutions in the climate change and mental problems. We also highlight the benefit of mitigating climate change, not only in improving economy, but also in ensuring the well-being of citizens. But from a Global South perspective, one of the responsibilities of governments is to demand accountability from the major drivers of the climate crisis. And I'm happy that even 27 and this year, we already are talking about loss and damages. But perhaps what is missing is how do we include mental health problems, in the calculation of loss and damages, because loss and damage are not only economic damages and physical health damages, but also our hearts and brains are affected by the climate crisis. So it's important that work together, the government, communities, and different sectors to co-create solutions and to realize collective action. I'll stop there.
Gary?
I don't know if Jennifer wanted
Or Jennifer?
I feel like John has said it all, and yeah, that's a very good way of looking at it. I think very importantly is evidence. Evidence is still lacking, and you only can get evidence by listening to people and gathering data from people's lived experience of the problem. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Other thoughts or questions? Or sorry, excuse me, Gary.
So it's just music to my ears hearing this, because this is the way we crafted the roadmap to make this possible everywhere, and the expectation that this is how it goes. We went to each of the organizations that became early adopters. We did not say, "Oh, we have a mental health plan for you. We have a depression plan for you." We asked, "What is hard for you to do the work you're doing?" And we eventually got somewhere where the psychological toolkit helped them. And that toolkit ranges from evidence of layperson-led skills to do the care of folks who are acutely depressed. A lot of the work can be done by community. It ranged from there to prevention, promotion sorts of things, community change kinds of things. So instead of bending the community towards our toolkit, we bent the toolkit towards what the community was telling us was hard for them, that it might help them with, and designed projects that would be accountable to those ends. So we went through every system and asked this question. So we have huge ground game sort of efforts to still our community members, like with Sheila. But we also have policy efforts, like with ICLEI. And I'll just end with one where John ended. When we went to finance systems, insurers, investors, we asked them, and they were interested in workshopping, how do we measure emotional loss and damage? How do we calculate that into what the costs are and what the investments in strengthening these communities should be? And so that is another early adopter effort. You get smarter, better stuff that leverages the psychological toolkit when you ask what problems do people think they can help them solve with. And so we've organized this massive amount of tools into basically two tasks of care and tasks of change. That psychological resilience, this process of psychological resilience, should be able to help people care for each other and drive change where they are as they define it. And actually our roadmap is called a roadmap for care and change. And that has to be we should be doing population mental health that way anyway, but we especially need it for the force multiplier that climate change is. We have to do it that way.
I'm being told that we're at time, which I completely am surprised by because I've been so engaged, informed, and inspired by this conversation. I think, though, at the risk of belaboring what we've heard, from Sheila and Kate and Jennifer and John and Gary, I do think it is worth emphasizing that we both have to navigate, as we do in any kind of urgent moment, caring for kind of people, the women, Sheila, that you're working with, kind of the communities that so many of you are working with, that we all are part of, and also at the population level, and being thoughtful about how we kind of ask the questions to elicit the data that we need kind of as we kind of navigate, hopefully in a congruent and kind of mutually supportive way, both of those priorities. And one point I do really just want to emphasize, so often, I think, Sheila, we don't spend enough time talking about how these conversations intersect with gender, or to John's point, how these conversations intersect with different generations. And so just incredibly thankful, Gary, that I know the roadmap is focused on kind of people who are vulnerable because of where they live and their kind of income status and social determinants of health, but also because of their gender, their family status, and their generation. So, we at CGI are so proud to be kind of partners in this work and look forward to continuing the conversation. And I'm sorry we kind of couldn't ask more of you for your reflections or your questions, but I hope that you enjoyed our kind of remarkable panelists' thoughts, reflections, ideas, kind of, and urging us all forward as much as I did. Thank you so much.